When we imagine the American dream, we often picture a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. A house with a white picket fence, 2 cars in the garage, college education for the kids, and a secure retirement. For decades, this vision has been central to America's identity and promise. But what if I told you that this dream has become increasingly out of reach for millions of Americans? What if the economic progress we think we've made since the 1950s is largely an illusion? Hello, I'm Your Name, and today we're going to explore a troubling economic reality that's hiding in plain sight. We'll analyze data spanning from 1950 to 2023 to understand what's really happened to America's middle class. And what we'll discover might surprise you. While many assume the middle class is doing fine, the data tells a completely different story. By looking at the relationship between income growth and inflation over more than 7 decades, we'll uncover how the economic foundation of American society has slowly eroded beneath our feet. This isn't about politics, it's about understanding the numbers and what they reveal about our economic reality. Let's start by looking back at what many economists call the golden age of the American middle class, the post-World War II boom from 1950 to 1970. During these 2 decades, the United States experienced extraordinary economic growth. The median household income grew from $3,319 in 1950 to $9,867 in 1970. But more importantly, when we adjust for inflation, the real purchasing power of middle-class families increased by nearly 85% during this period, with an average annual growth rate of 3.11%. This was a time when a single breadwinner could support a family of 4, buy a home, own a car, and save for the future. College was affordable, healthcare costs were manageable, and retirement seemed secure through a combination of pensions and social security. What made this possible? Several factors contributed to this prosperity. First, the United States emerged from World War II with its industrial capacity intact while much of the world was rebuilding, giving American companies and workers a significant advantage in global markets. Second, union membership peaked during this era, with about 1/3 of American workers belonging to unions. This gave workers more bargaining power to secure higher wages and better benefits. Third, the top marginal tax rates were much higher than today, over 90% during the Eisenhower administration, which funded massive public investments in infrastructure, education, and research. Fourth, financial regulations put in place after the Great Depression kept the banking system relatively stable and focused on supporting the real economy rather than speculation. The result was an unprecedented expansion of the middle class. Between 1950 and 1970, the proportion of Americans who could be classified as middle class grew significantly and income inequality decreased. This period saw the creation of the suburban lifestyle, the expansion of public universities, and the growth of industries that provided stable, well-paying jobs with benefits. The average worker saw their standard of living improve substantially year after year. It's worth noting that not everyone benefited equally from this prosperity. Women and minorities faced significant barriers to full economic participation. But overall, this period represented the closest America has ever come to realizing its promise of broadly shared prosperity. The 1970s marked a dramatic turning point for America's middle class, one that would fundamentally alter their economic trajectory for the next 5 decades. During this decade, Americans experienced something new and troubling: stagflation, a combination of high inflation and economic stagnation. The oil crisis of 1973, when OPEC imposed an oil embargo, sent energy prices soaring. Inflation reached double digits, peaking at 14.8% in 1980. On the surface, incomes appeared to be growing rapidly. The median household income rose from $9,867 in 1970 to $21,023 by 1980, an impressive 113% increase. But this is where analyzing nominal versus real income becomes crucial to understanding what was really happening. When we adjust for inflation, the reality becomes clear. Despite the substantial nominal income growth of 7.86% annually, the real income growth, after accounting for inflation, was a mere 0.03% per year. This means that, for all practical purposes, middle-class purchasing power remained completely stagnant throughout the decade. Think about what this means. Despite working just as hard, despite the economy continuing to grow, and despite paychecks getting bigger, middle-class families could buy essentially the same amount of goods and services in 1980 as they could in 1970. A decade of economic progress had effectively been erased by inflation. Several structural changes began during this period that would continue to affect the middle class in subsequent decades. Manufacturing jobs, traditionally a source of well-paying middle-class employment, began to decline as companies started moving production overseas. Union membership began its long-term decline, reducing workers' collective bargaining power. Financial deregulation began, starting a trend that would accelerate in the following decades. Increased global competition put downward pressure on wages for many workers. This period marked the end of the automatic year-over-year improvements in living standards that many Americans had come to expect. The 1970s were the first indication that the economic system was no longer working as well for ordinary Americans as it had in the previous 2 decades. Perhaps most significantly, this decade saw the beginning of a disconnect between productivity and wages. Prior to 1970, increases in worker productivity were closely matched by increases in worker compensation. After 1970, productivity continued to rise, but wages began to lag behind, a trend that would only worsen in the coming decades. By the end of the 1970s, many middle-class Americans were feeling economically squeezed for the first time since the Great Depression. Little did they know that this was just the beginning of a much longer period of challenges. The period from 1980 to 2000 is often characterized as the neoliberal era, marked by policies emphasizing privatization, deregulation, free trade, and reduced government spending on social programs. These 2 decades saw dramatic changes in the American economic landscape that would further impact the middle class. During this period, median household income rose from $21,023 in 1980 to $50,732 in 2000, a 141% increase in nominal terms. However, after adjusting for inflation, the real income growth was much more modest. Real income grew at just 0.29% annually from 1980 to 1995. And with a slight improvement to 0.35% from 1995 to 2000. But these rates were still far below the robust 3.11% annual growth experienced during the 1950 to 1970 period. The 1980s and 90s saw several major transformations. First, the economy underwent a significant shift from manufacturing to services. In 1980, manufacturing accounted for about 20% of all jobs. By 2000, it had fallen to about 13%. These lost manufacturing jobs were often replaced by service sector jobs that offered lower wages and fewer benefits. Second, globalization accelerated dramatically, with international trade agreements like NAFTA increasing competition for American workers. While this created new markets for American companies, it also put downward pressure on wages for many middle-class workers. Third, the financial sector grew substantially in size and influence, shifting from about 3% of GDP in 1950 to over 8% by 2000. This coincided with multiple waves of deregulation that changed how finance operated and its relationship to the rest of the economy. Fourth, technological change, particularly computerization, began transforming workplaces. While this increased productivity, the benefits of these productivity gains increasingly flowed to owners of capital rather than to workers. Fifth, tax policies changed significantly, with top marginal rates falling from 70% in 1980 to 39.6% by 2000, reducing the progressivity of the tax system. Despite these challenges, the 1980s and 90s weren't entirely negative for the middle class. The late 1990s in particular saw a brief period of stronger wage growth across all income levels, fueled by the dot-com boom and historically low unemployment rates. The median household income reached its highest inflation-adjusted level to date in 1999. However, this period also saw the beginning of several troubling trends that would have long-term implications. Income inequality began to rise dramatically, with the share of income going to the top 1% increasing from about 10% in 1980 to about 20% by 2000. Household debt began to grow as families increasingly turned to credit cards and loans to maintain their standard of living. Healthcare and education costs began to rise much faster than general inflation, creating new financial pressures. The norm of employer-provided defined benefit pension plans began to give way to 401k plans, shifting retirement risk to individual workers. By 2000, the economic landscape had fundamentally changed. While some middle-class families prospered during this period, many others found themselves working harder just to maintain their position. The foundations of middle-class economic security, stable employment, affordable healthcare, accessible education, and secure retirement were becoming increasingly unstable. The first decade of the 21st century was bookended by two significant economic shocks: the dot-com bust at the beginning and the Great Recession at the end. These events would further expose the fragility of middle-class economic security. During this period, median household income grew from $50,732 in 2000 to $61,272 in 2010, a 20.8% increase in nominal terms. However, when adjusted for inflation, this represented a real growth rate of just 0.35% annually, continuing the pattern of sluggish growth for middle-class incomes. The decade began with the collapse of the dot-com bubble in 2000, which wiped out about $5 trillion in market value and was followed by a mild recession. While the broader economy recovered relatively quickly, many middle-class jobs in the technology sector disappeared and were not fully replaced. However, the defining economic event of the decade was undoubtedly the financial crisis and Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. This crisis, triggered by the collapse of the housing market and the subsequent meltdown in mortgage-backed securities, led to the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression. The impact on the middle class was devastating. Approximately 8.7 million jobs were lost during the recession, with unemployment peaking at 10% in October 2009. About $9.8 trillion in household wealth evaporated as home values and retirement accounts plummeted. Approximately 10 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. Median household wealth fell by 39% between 2007 and 2010, erasing decades of accumulation. Even before the crisis, middle-class families were facing challenges. Healthcare costs continued to rise faster than inflation, with the average family premium for employer-sponsored health insurance increasing by 78% between 2001 and 2008. College tuition rose even faster, making higher education increasingly unaffordable without taking on substantial debt. The recovery from the Great Recession was notably slow and uneven. While the stock market eventually rebounded, benefiting those with significant investments, job growth was tepid for years. Many of the jobs lost during the recession were middle-wage positions, but a disproportionate share of the jobs created during the recovery were in low-wage sectors. This period also saw the continuation of several troubling trends. Income inequality continued to increase, with the top 1% capturing 95% of the income gains during the recovery period from 2009 to 2012. Household debt reached all-time highs, with mortgage debt, student loan debt, and credit card debt all growing substantially. The labor force participation rate began a long-term decline as many workers, particularly older workers, gave up looking for employment altogether. By the end of the decade, many middle-class Americans found themselves in a precarious position, with diminished wealth, higher debt, and lingering economic insecurity. While the technical recession had ended by 2009, the effects continued to reverberate through middle-class communities for years afterward. The period from 2010 to 2023 was meant to be one of recovery and rebuilding for the middle class after the devastation of the Great Recession. Instead, it brought new challenges and, for the first time since the 1950s, an actual decline in middle-class purchasing power. Nominally, median household income rose from $61,272 in 2010 to $74,580 by 2023, an increase of about 21.7%. However, when adjusted for inflation, we see something alarming. Real income actually decreased at an average annual rate of 1.01%. This means that the typical middle-class family could buy less in 2023 than they could in 2010, a clear regression in their standard of living. This period can be divided into distinct phases. The early 2010s saw a slow but steady recovery from the Great Recession. Unemployment gradually declined, reaching pre-recession levels by around 2016. However, wage growth remained sluggish, and many of the new jobs created paid less than those lost during the recession. From roughly 2016 to early 2020, the economy strengthened, with unemployment reaching historic lows and wages finally beginning to grow meaningfully across the income spectrum. For a brief period, it appeared that middle-class fortunes might be improving substantially for the first time in decades. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, which caused unprecedented economic disruption. While the immediate response, including expanded unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, and the Paycheck Protection Program, helped prevent a complete economic collapse, the pandemic nevertheless inflicted significant damage on many middle-class households and small businesses. The recovery from the pandemic was surprisingly swift in some respects, with unemployment returning to low levels by 2022. However, this rapid recovery, combined with supply chain disruptions, led to the highest inflation rates in over 40 years. In 2021 to 2022, inflation peaked at over 9%, severely eroding middle-class purchasing power. This most recent phase highlights several critical issues facing the middle class. Housing affordability reached crisis levels in many parts of the country, with both home prices and rents far outpacing wage growth. Healthcare costs continued their relentless rise, with family premiums for employer-sponsored health insurance increasing by 55% between 2010 and 2020. The burden of student loan debt grew enormously, with total outstanding student loans reaching $1.75 trillion by 2023, up from about $1 trillion in 2013. Retirement insecurity worsened, with only about half of private sector workers participating in any type of retirement plan. Childcare costs skyrocketed, forcing many families to make difficult choices between work and family care. Perhaps most concerning was the decline in real wages during the inflationary period of 2021 to 2023. Despite a tight labor market and nominal wage increases, inflation outpaced wage growth for most workers, meaning that their purchasing power actually declined, a troubling development that hadn't been seen at this scale since the 1970s. By 2023, many metrics suggested that the typical middle-class family was worse off than they had been a decade earlier, despite the economy having grown substantially during that period. Now that we've examined each period separately, let's step back and look at the entire 73-year span from 1950 to 2023 to understand the big picture of what's happened to America's middle class. The raw numbers tell a story that initially seems positive. Median household income grew from $3,319 in 1950 to $74,580 in 2023. A staggering 2,147% increase. However, during the same period, consumer prices rose by about 1,156%. When we adjust for inflation, the real income growth over these 7 decades was approximately 78.8%. That translates to an average annual real growth rate of just 0.80%. To put this in perspective, at this growth rate, it takes about 87 years for real incomes to double. Compare this to the 3.11% growth rate during the 1950 to 1970 period, when real incomes would double in just 23 years. Even more revealing is the distribution of this growth over time. About half of the total real income growth occurred during the 1950 to 1970 period, just 20 of the 73 years. From 1970 to 2010, real income grew by only about 10% over the entire 40-year period. From 2010 to 2023, real income actually declined by about 12%. This pattern reveals a profoundly troubling trajectory: rapid progress for the first 2 decades after World War II, followed by decades of near stagnation and most recently actual decline. Several other metrics confirm this troubling picture. Home ownership. The home ownership rate in 1950 was about 55%. It peaked at around 69% in 2004, but has since declined to about 65%. More importantly, the median home price has risen from about 2 times the median annual income in 1950 to over 4 times the median annual income today. Education. In 1950, a year of college at a public university cost about 4% of the median family income. Today, it costs about 23% of median family income. Household debt as a percentage of income has risen dramatically. In 1950, household debt was about 25% of disposable income. Today, it's over 100% retirement. In 1980, about 60% of private sector workers were covered by defined benefit pension plans. Today, that figure is less than 15%. Wealth. While middle-class incomes have stagnated, wealth concentration has increased dramatically. The share of wealth owned by the top 1% has risen from about 23% in 1950 to nearly 40% today. Perhaps most tellingly, the share of Americans who identify as middle class has shrunk significantly, from about 60% in 1970 to about 50% today, with more people identifying as lower class or working class. All of these metrics point to the same conclusion. Despite enormous economic growth and technological progress over the past 7 decades, the economic position of the typical American family has improved only modestly since 1950 and has actually deteriorated since 1970 in many respects. This represents a profound failure of our economic system to deliver on its promise of broadly shared prosperity. The erosion of middle-class economic security isn't just a problem for those directly affected. It has profound implications for American society as a whole. First, economic mobility, the ability to improve one's economic position, has declined significantly. Studies show that a child born in the 1940s had a 90% chance of earning more than their parents. For children born in the 1980s, that chance had fallen to just 50%. This undermines the American dream itself, the idea that hard work and determination will lead to a better life. Second, declining middle-class prosperity has contributed to political polarization and instability. When people feel economically insecure, they become more susceptible to populist appeals, more distrustful of institutions, and more likely to view politics in zero-sum terms. The erosion of the middle class correlates strongly with the increasing polarization we've seen in American politics. Third, reduced middle-class purchasing power constrains economic growth. Consumer spending accounts for about 70% of US GDP. When middle-class families have less to spend, the entire economy suffers. This creates a negative feedback loop. Slower growth leads to fewer good jobs, which further weakens the middle class. Fourth, the hollowing out of the middle class has significant social consequences. Communities with a strong middle class tend to have better educational outcomes, lower crime rates, greater civic engagement, and stronger social cohesion. As the middle class shrinks, these positive social outcomes become more difficult to achieve. Fifth, increasing inequality and middle-class insecurity has led to a crisis of faith in capitalism itself, particularly among younger generations. A 2019 Gallup poll found that only 45% of young adults view capitalism positively, compared to 68% in 2010. The key takeaway is this: the economic challenges facing the middle class aren't just the result of impersonal market forces, they're the consequence of specific policy choices made over decades. The decision to prioritize low inflation over full employment in monetary policy, the choice to reduce taxes on capital and wealth while maintaining higher taxes on labor, the failure to adequately enforce antitrust laws allowing increased market concentration, the weakening of labor protections and collective bargaining rights, the decision to allow healthcare, education and housing costs to rise far faster than inflation, the financialization of the economy which has prioritized short-term profits over long-term investment. Different policy choices could have led to different outcomes, as demonstrated by other advanced economies that have maintained stronger middle classes over the same period. As we've seen through our analysis of income and inflation data from 1950 to 2023, the story of America's middle class is far more complex and concerning than most people realize. The narrative that each generation of Americans automatically does better than the last is simply not supported by the evidence of the past 5 decades. Instead, we see a pattern of initial strong growth followed by decades of stagnation and most recently decline. This isn't to say that life hasn't improved in many ways. Technological advances have created products and services that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Healthcare innovations have extended lifespans and improved quality of life. The internet has democratized access to information and created new opportunities. But the core economic foundation of middle-class life, the ability to afford a home, raise a family, educate children, receive quality healthcare and retire with dignity, has become increasingly precarious for millions of Americans. The data we've examined reveals a profound disconnect between overall economic growth and the economic well-being of ordinary citizens. While GDP has grown enormously since 1950, the benefits of this growth have increasingly flowed to those at the top of the economic ladder. The middle class hasn't disappeared, but it has been squeezed from multiple directions: stagnant wages, rising costs for essentials, increasing debt, and greater economic instability. The good news is that this situation isn't inevitable. Policy choices created these conditions, and different policy choices could help reverse them. Countries like Norway, Germany, and Australia have demonstrated that advanced economies can maintain a strong middle class in the 21st century with the right policies. The first step toward finding solutions is acknowledging the reality of the problem. By understanding the true economic history of America's middle class over the past 7 decades, we can begin to have honest conversations about what's gone wrong and how to fix it. The American dream doesn't have to be an illusion. With clear-eyed analysis and thoughtful policy changes, we can work to restore the economic security and opportunity that once made the American middle class the envy of the world. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, please like, subscribe, and share this video to help others understand this crucial issue. And let me know in the comments, how is your experience matched with the data we've explored?